Hello everybody, so this week's topic is urban forestry. And so really just trying to summarize the idea of taking care of these larger green spaces within urban areas. And so just the idea of what is the difference between, an urban forest as opposed to kind of what we normally do. So let's take a look. So let's start off with some definitions. So urban forestry is defined as the management of naturally occurring and planted trees and associated plants in urban areas. Whereas arboriculture, which is what we do, is the practice and study of the care of trees and other woody plants in the landscape. So you can do arboriculture within urban forestry, and it's a normal part of the job. And really just the difference in urban forestry versus just regular arboriculture is the idea that with arboriculture we might have a tree or a few trees, but in urban forest we're going to have these larger green spaces, whether they're parks or wilderness areas or greenways or streamside areas, whatever it is. Lots of different examples of green spaces out there. That's what'll make up the urban forest, and really it's the combination of all of those little pieces together that'll really make up the urban forest. There are multiple careers, but the career paths you might hear most often mentioned with urban forestry are municipal arborist, city or urban forester, tree warden, and municipal tree officer. Those are some of the names of the people working within the urban forestry realm. So benefits and costs of trees. Let me slide myself out of the way so you guys can see that easily. So trees provide direct and indirect costs, and we're going to go into them in a little bit of detail in the upcoming slides. But environmental improvements, aesthetic enhancements, economic savings, and social benefits in terms of our direct and indirect benefits to the surrounding area. Our costs are going to be planting, and then anything else that really falls under the idea of maintenance. So whether it's irrigation, pruning, plant health care, debris cleanup, risk management, which may then lead into things like tree removal, and all of that. All of that would go into the costs. So let's go over the benefits in a little more detail. I'm going to slide myself back up in the corner again. There we go. All right, so environmental benefits. That's a good place for us to start. So lots of environmental benefits: improving air quality, sequestering carbon, so carbon sequestration. So just think of the idea that CO2 is the gas in our atmosphere. Trees take in CO2, they give off give off O2, which is oxygen. So they provide us oxygen, which is fantastic. And this infographic says a single tree produces approximately 260 pounds of oxygen per year, meaning 2 mature trees can provide enough oxygen for a family of 4. So that's fantastic. So the tree gives us oxygen, but what it's also doing at the same time is sequestering carbon. So it's a threefold process right there. Takes CO2 out of the atmosphere, gives us oxygen to breathe, and then stores carbon within the wood. All fantastic, perfect, excellent things for our environment. They will conserve energy, or really the idea that you can conserve energy. If you have trees on specific sides of your houses, and it's going to block out the sunlight. So during the summer months, you don't have to run the air conditioner as much. But then also making sure, if you're going to do something like that, you plant deciduous trees instead of evergreen trees, so that when it's then the winter, all the leaves will fall off, but then the sunlight will come in, and then you get some heating to where you don't have to use your heater as much. So thinking about ways like that to conserve energy really can provide it's a benefit to you, but it's also a benefit to the environment in that we're not using machinery. We're not having to create more things. We're not having to use energy and come up with, more factories to build more air conditioning units and all of that. It's a multi-factored benefit. Reduces stormwater runoff and erosion. It's going to filter the air, so not only is it improving the air quality, but it's also filtering out particulate matter that's harmful to us. Providing shade, which is an extremely beneficial use of trees in the urban environment. And in fact, I would personally argue it's the most beneficial environment. I put this in the environmental benefit category, but really it's also it's a people benefit, but it is also an environmental benefit in that wildlife will use it in the same way that we use it. And then also, if you think about the different types of plants and how certain plants will grow better in a shaded environment as opposed to a completely open, sunny environment, things like that, to where the trees themselves are also helping out the environment by providing shade, but it's also extremely important to us as well. And then just the idea of wildlife habitat and the idea of being able to see nature. I think we kind of overlook it sometimes. You see something like a squirrel and you're like, it's a squirrel, who cares? That's nature. We're able to see that without having trees and having urban forests. We wouldn't be able to get to see something like squirrels or mice or birds on a daily basis. And I think there's a lot of us that enjoy when we get to see those animals. Economic benefits. Certainly talked about these ideas of reducing cooling expenses. You get increased property values when you have more trees in your area or on your property. And then also having trees in an area is going to attract businesses and residences to that area. Here, specifically looking at this infographic for Pennsylvania, urban trees in the state contribute $4.2 billion in community-wide environmental benefits, like we just talked about. The urban forestry sector in Pennsylvania has an annual sales and employment footprint of $3.3 billion, and trees cover at private homes adds $2 billion annually to property values. So it's there. The values are there when we're able to quantify it. So to really give people the numbers, to really get them to understand how important trees are and having trees can be to your area. Social benefits. This one is interesting, but it's really important. When you get down to psychological benefits, people tend to be drawn to areas with trees, especially in cities, and this has been a cultural thing for a long time. And you can trace it back to even certain cultures value certain trees as being sacred to the culture. There you get more stress reduction due to having trees or being able to be in the view of trees, including there's been studies done with hospital recovery times, and that hospital recovery times are shorter if trees are visible to the patients. And so there are definite social or human benefits to urban forests. And then a big one that I definitely think we all understand, but we just kind of need to say it, is the idea of aesthetics. The idea that trees make trees and these urban forests make everything more beautiful, more interesting, more lively. Take this example here of New York and Central Park, which is a great example of an urban forest. How different would New York City be without Central Park? I'm definitely not saying, well, nobody would go to New York if there's no Central Park. But think about if you've been to New York, if you understand the importance of Central Park to New York and all the things that happen at Central Park and all the different parts of Central Park. It's really it's a cultural. It's a piece of the culture of New York City. It is a defining piece of New York City. And it's really important to understand the aesthetics that Central Park brings to a city like New York. In fact, even thinking about some of the fancy neighborhoods, they are fancy because they border the park. You'll hear things like Central Park West. And so the idea that a place can be worth more money because you can see the park, because you can see the forest, because you can get to the forest really easily, that's super important. And so the aesthetics that an urban forest can provide to a place is almost just innumerable and immeasurable to really understand how important in terms of aesthetics an urban forest can be. And so let's just kind of talk about some different planning and management considerations when thinking about the idea of urban forestry. So the first one we're going to start off with is green infrastructure. So the idea of the natural resources upon which the city is built. So you're talking about your trees, your urban streams, your parks, your wilderness areas, greenways, conservation easements, and working lands. This right here is a couple examples from Columbia, Missouri, and they have an extensive system of bike trails that go throughout the city and actually connect the city to other cities. And just thinking about all the different greenery that goes into this, what would be considered a greenway, and trying to take the path along the stream here, and all the trees and plants that will grow in that specific area versus the trees and plants that are grown and grow when looking down below at this picture. In this area, we still have some stream off to our right, but you're getting a little bit different landscape, probably a different soil, and so different trees that are growing. And so how do we tie all those areas in together? How do we manage an area? So if we're in charge of Columbia, Missouri, we don't just say, well, we got to manage the bike trails and then that's it. It's the bike trails, the city parks, the any other areas that you'll have conservation easements, anywhere that is a green area that you can work on. And how is that going to work? How are we going to tie it in? How, if we've got wildlife in this area, how is the wildlife going to use these different areas? How do they tie into each other? How do we get all the work done that we'll need to do at these places? We want to really try and think about all that when we're thinking about the idea of green infrastructure and its importance to the city. And that, really gets driven home also on the idea of sustainability. So we're going to define sustainability specifically for urban forestry as the ability to maintain ecological, social, and economic benefits over time. One of the big things is that you need to plan for succession because you have a limited lifespan of trees. So you're going to have trees that grow and trees that, live and thrive and die, and some of them are going to be for 20 years, and some of them are going to be for 30 years, and some of them are going to be 60 years, and 80 years, and 100 years, and 500 years or 1,000 years, depending on the types of trees that you plant. And so you're going to have all these different trees that provide all these different benefits, but eventually those trees might come down. And so how are you going to get new trees planted, or how are you going to maintain them, or how are you going to try and keep this tree in this area for as long as possible? We've gone over all those sorts of methods building up to this, but now we're just kind of going over the big picture idea of it. And really the idea is you want to almost look at your whole urban area, whatever that is, a city, a piece of a city, one specific park, whatever it is that you're managing. You want to look at it as just an uneven aged forest. So you've got trees of various maturities, and how do you, if you take this one out, how do you replace it? If you take this group out here, what's going to come in, and what's next, and how does that tie in with everything else, and how does it provide benefit? Is it going to provide the same benefit as these other things, or can we bring in something specifically that's going to add another beneficial element that we didn't have before? It's all those sorts of things that we want to think about, because we want to have a good ecology. We want to have good interaction with our environment. We want to enjoy the trees, but we also want to maximize the economic benefits out of the trees. We want the trees to be able to provide us with everything that they can. We want to use them because they are a natural resource. We want to be able to use them as a resource. Inventories. So inventories are definitely part of the planning and management, probably the biggest part of urban forest management, and trying to figure out how exactly are you going to do it, and which manner are you going to do it, and how do you get all that information, and how many people are you going to need, and what do you do with all the data. It's really important in my mind these days that you get comfortable with GPS and GIS, because that's the easiest way to start a tree inventory, and really because especially in urban areas, all these places are going to be spaced out and going to be separated, so you really need to have some sort of mapping, some sort of location, and then have with that location all the available information. So you can see in this map here, you click on a dot, it gives you the information like the street that it's on, the common name, the genus, the species, the DBH of it, the condition, the maintenance routine. So all sorts of good information that tells us exactly what we need to know about the specific tree in the specific area at this specific spot. And so you do have, depending on budget and time, which is always what inventories come down to, is budget and time. You do have kind of three basic options. You can randomly sample, but if you think about it and you look at just this map here and think about how separated out all these areas are and all those trees are, just taking a random tree here or there is, it'll give you just some kind of basic ideas, but really is not going to tell you much. You can take partial inventories, if you're really limited by time. Maybe you take some stuff from the southwest and some stuff from the southeast and some stuff from the northwest and the central, and just kind of go with that, because that's what you can do. But really, if you're really trying to get information that's useful and really try and tie in all of these different areas and really look at it as your green infrastructure and how you're going to make all these parts work together, you've got to get a complete inventory, because it is the best way to know all about all of these trees and everything about these trees, and being able to really look at it as a whole picture, and then look at holistically, how am I going to manage this whole area together. A complete inventory is what you need. Now, a lot of work, a lot of time, a lot of effort, but as long as the money is there, that's what really needs to be done. And so one system that really exists, one system that I've used personally before and quite enjoy, is iTree. And iTree is a set of assessment and management tools that calculates cost-benefit analysis for populations of trees based on inventory and management approaches. That sounds fancy. That's how your book describes it. What would I describe it as? It's a system that you enter in tree data. You do some analysis, some very simple analysis. It puts a dot, shows you a picture, it puts a dot, and it says, what is this? And you can tell it it's a tree, or you can tell it, no, that's water, or that's grass, or that's a shrub, or that's a road. And all of a sudden it starts to be able to look at a picture and start calculating, and then start figuring out, without you having to go to all of these places. Now you can do some remotely sensed inventory, and you really start to gather data, and then you can use all this data tied into this one system, and you start being able to really quantify what you have in amounts and dollars, and in numbers. Really the best way in my mind to think about it is you can quantify it in numbers that make sense to people who aren't arborists, people who don't really understand trees, but you can sit there, they can look at a tree and they go, oh, that's a nice tree. But you can tell them it's this big, and it's going to get to this big, and it's going to provide X amount of dollars And then when it gets to this age, that's when it starts dipping off. So that's when we start to look to replace it with a younger tree. And these are the trees that we're looking at. All of a sudden now that's got numbers, and that's a picture that you can paint much easier for people who aren't, as educated in trees as you will be. Tree ordinances, something to get familiar with. So tree ordinances are defined as legal regulations drafted and instituted to protect trees within a given jurisdiction. And so, I mean, I hope it would go without saying, but an arborist or a forester, whoever is the person in charge, should be involved in drafting the tree ordinances. And then really you want to ensure that any preservation, maintenance, or any of the work required by the tree ordinance is consistent with best management practices. And best management practices just being the idea of the best way to do something, right? Not the okay way, not the this is good enough way, but the best way that's going to get back to this idea that we had of maximizing the benefits of the tree while also ensuring sustainability. And really, there's, if you've been raised the way I have, which obviously everybody's different, but the idea of being told, there's a right way to do something is really, that's what I think about when I think about BMPs. I think about just somebody saying, here, there is a right way to do something. There's all sorts of ways you can choose to do it, but there are specific right ways, and here is some examples of how to do it the right way. Some examples of tree ordinances, specifically. I know I just said examples of BMPs, but we're really examples of tree ordinances is what these are. So requirements for property owners to care for trees that are within right-of-way zones adjacent to their property. That's definitely something that happens if you live right up to a city street, or you have it to where your back wall is also the wall that's next to the street, so the tree might come over into your yard. Those sorts of things definitely happen. If you've got a park, but we see this in Bakersfield all the time. You got parks, but you have utilities going through the park. There has to be some sort of ordinance as to who's maintaining that and who's doing what with it. Guidelines and requirements for obtaining permits for anybody who's going to be doing tree planting, maintenance, or removal of trees. That doesn't exist everywhere, but there are certainly areas where permitting is how you get things done. Authorizations for people to do tree inspections on private properties, acceptable species list, and then all sorts of tree ordinances usually that have to do with things like regulations, where you're trying to prohibit certain actions like topping of trees or the idea of maybe even tree removal that's not allowed in certain areas. And so there's all sorts of different tree areas different tree ordinances for different areas, and it can vary widely. Standards and specifications. So when we talk about a standard, we're talking about an established or widely recognized authority of acceptable performance. When you say a standard, this is the minimum that you have to get to, and failure to comply with that should be met with fines or other penalties. You'll see often in areas that you've got to do this, and then this is the penalty for not doing that. Whereas specifications, when we're talking about specifications or specs, you'll hear people just say specs. You're talking about detailed plans, requirements, and statements of procedures or standards used to define or guide actions. And you want to have specifications in all of your tree work, from planting to removal and all the maintenance and everything else in between. And this is where your BMPs really come in handy, because your BMPs are the more descriptive how-to for tree care and management. So it's when we talk about specifications, that's what BMPs are. You know, this is how you do it. This is what you need. If you're going to put in a road here, this is the grade that you need to do. And if you got this kind of a steep slope, then you need to put in water bars, and the water bars need to be this big and this wide. And that's the sort of thing that goes into a best management practice manual, and it really gets into this idea of specifications. And a lot of this really leads up to the idea of a management plan and all the information and all the details that need to go into a management plan. And a management plan itself, it formulates and documents the strategies and procedures for managing trees within a predefined area. I mean, that's pretty simple, but also all-encompassing at the same time. Components of a management plan: defining key goals and objectives, establishing guidelines and limitations, determining the resources needed, and looking at that holistically. So the human resources that you're going to need, the financial resources that you're going to need, the public resources that you're going to need in terms of public support, or certain areas within town, or the idea that, you know, if there's a problem here, you know, which fire department or which police, or do we need to, instead of police, do we need to use a ranger system, like if we have a park? So, you know, take Bakersfield, for example. You got Hart Park, and you got the nature preserve, and all these areas, they have to have the sheriffs as opposed to the police, because the police are busy with the city. So they've got the sheriffs, and they have a specific ranger division within the sheriffs to take care of those specific areas. Environmental resources, you know, what do we need to make this work in terms of the environment? Do we have areas that'll work, or do we need to do things to make it work? You definitely have your tree inventory is your key component to your management plan, because that's your data, and that's where we're really, you know, as long as you've got the data, now we can start doing all these other things, because now we know what we have. So now we can determine what resources we need, that then we can establish our guidelines and limitations as to what we can and can't do. We really, you know, all the while still thinking about our key goals and objectives. And then what else can go into a management plan, as much as you can fit into it without making it burdensome. But, you know, planning, preservation, maintenance, risk management, removal and replacement, operations, emergency or storm response, public relations, and education. As all of that, if you want to have a very detailed urban forestry management plan, you want to put as much of that in there as possible. Tree diversity. Is tree diversity important? Absolutely. But you got to get it right. Right tree in the right place. Species-site relationships are everything. Put the right trees where they're supposed to go, because that's what's going to ensure tree survival and maximize benefits, which is everything that we've been talking about in terms of sustainability and really being able to be successful in urban forestry. Maximize those benefits, maximize our natural resources, while also ensuring tree survival and vitality. We're really also talking about the reason to have tree diversity is to avoid catastrophic loss. So if we keep our densities to less than 30% from a single family, less than 20% from a single genus, and less than 10% of a single species, we're probably going to be fine. So we want to mix it up as much as possible. And not only do we want to mix it up by species, but we also want to mix it up by size and age class, which we kind of mentioned before, is the idea we want to have big trees and little trees, because we want to have trees growing all at a lot of different rates, so that when we lose one, we can replace one very easily. But if we lose, 400 at the same time, that's going to take a lot more effort to get done. Another thing that becomes really important then is, if we're going to do all this work within these urban forests, what are we going to do with the wood that we end up gaining from these urban forests? So when we have to go in and prune, when we have to go in and cut down trees, when we have to do any of this work, what are we doing with that leftover wood? The idea in the olden days was it ended up in landfills, or it just got burned, or you just chip it up but there's a lot of good things you can do with it. You can turn it into mulch, which is still, you're chipping it up, but then you're using it as your mulch. And if you're doing things right with the way that we've talked about in some of the previous lessons, you know how important mulch is and how much of a benefit mulch could be. So the idea that you're basically taking the your leftovers and then turning it into mulch would be a fantastic idea. Firewood and fuel wood, depending on the area that you're at, firewood is still the number one use of wood throughout the world. So as long as you're following all proper guidelines, selling firewood or even giving away firewood, really, it helps out the community and it helps you out. So it seems like a great idea. And then, turning, if we have, large pieces of our trunk, turning that into lumber, and whether that lumber gets used in, buildings, like your own buildings that you may need to upkeep, or, even turned into artisan crafts or whatever it is, as long as it's being used and not just, thrown in a landfill or something like that. There's so many better uses these days, and we have such a better understanding of how to use things and how to recycle things as opposed to just throwing them away. And wildlife habitat. So there's a lot of different considerations, but one of the things that I think is most interesting in terms of thinking about wildlife habitat is this picture right here. So this is what's called a wildlife corridor. So you can see, this is in some part of a town. We've got a freeway. We've got a sidewalk over there, or a bike path. And how do we incorporate the area for the wildlife? How do we make sure that the wildlife are still enjoying this area and still want to be a part of this area? Because we don't necessarily want to just kick wildlife out. Okay, well, we're taking over this area, and you guys can just buzz off. No, we like having the wildlife come. We like having randomly you get to see a deer in the morning, or you get to see the birds chirping outside of your window. You want that sort of thing. So we have to think about how do we provide wildlife with access to all the different parts of the habitat that they need. So you have to understand all the different species that you're dealing with and all the daily requirements of those species, and the idea of where are they going to get food, cover, water, how are they going to what requirements do they have in terms of mating and breeding. And so you have to understand that about your wildlife, and then you have to come up with ideas and find ways to still provide habitat for that wildlife without endangering or causing more problems with the urban environment. And so I think wildlife corridors are just a great example of that sort of thinking and that sort of ingenuity to really make sure that wildlife still get what they need, while also still saying, well, we understand it's an urban area, and we understand how important people are as well. So we're going to find something that can maybe be the best of both worlds. And then lastly, the idea of information and education, which is something that's obviously near and dear to my heart, because that's what I'm doing here, is trying to inform you guys, and then hopefully once you guys are informed, you're informing other people. But then also I am a part of the Tree Foundation of Kern County, so I'm on one of these urban forestry boards, and with the idea of trying to do different projects within the urban environment that allows for more green spaces, allows for more trees, and really promotes how important these areas and these trees and what benefits they can provide the community, because it's important to just get the message out there. And you can see that on the left here, the Oregon Department of Forestry feels the same way and is putting out, trying to put out information in this area to make sure that people, in terms of the general public, have a good understanding of just how important trees are. And so, in terms of urban forestry, there's a lot to understand and there's a lot to take in, but really, if you just kind of come down to the basics of it, you really want to just think about the idea of holistically, how do I make all these pieces fit together? It's a little bit easier in traditional forestry because you're really just, okay, here is my trees, here's my wildlife, here's my understory. All right, how do I make this all work? But now with urban forestry, you're thinking about, okay, here are my trees, here's my understory, here's my wildlife, here are my people, here are all these different areas because some of them are connected, but then a bunch of these aren't connected. And then there's all these different buildings and all these different microclimates and all these different situations. And how do I make that all work? How do I tie that all in together? And how do I make people still understand how important trees are in the urban environment and how much better we are for having trees in the urban environment? And if we can just get to, you know, that holistic thinking and just keep working the steps to try and get to that that holistic look at it, the better off we're going to be. So I hope you enjoyed that.